forever, up through and including today. And I got cross-cut sleds and all this stuff. Big, large panels are an issue. Always have been, always will be. The bigger the panel, the harder it is to cross-cut, particularly. A lot of your table saws and all will allow you to rip them, but cross-cutting them to any degree of accuracy is just tough. Well, the router to the rescue. Now we're going to talk about this. This is very, very simple. But before I do, I wanted to show you this because, well, I'm getting ready to use one. This is a flush trim router bit. About an inch long, 7/8 by an inch, 7/8 wide. But that has nothing to do with nothing. But the reason I wanted to show you this one is it has a 3/8 shank on it. Not a quarter, not a half. And the reason for this bit is that a lot of your CNCs run a 3/8 shank. And so you're going to encounter router bits that have 3/8 shanks. Now, so pay attention when you're reading, and you're ordering a bit, because there's two things that happen. One, there's an adapter you can get that converts it to a 1/2 inch. And I don't know about the other manufacturers. I feel sure probably they do. But I know that Porter Cable has a 3/8 collet. And that's just that simple. Is it a better bit? Not necessarily. They're used in the big CNC machines. One of the simplest ways of cutting a big panel is to take a straight edge. This happens just to be a piece of MDF, but it wouldn't matter how big it is. A straight edge that we can index off of using our bearing. Now this means, now notice something, this is an inch bearing, it's an inch long, an inch bit. And I really don't want to take that big of a hunk off at one time. Or in the case where you've got a big thick top. Now common sense would say that you want to cut this as close as you can, using a skill saw, jigsaw, whatever you can. And usually I like to leave an 1/8, not much more than a 1/4. And again, that depends upon how hard and dense the wood is. But I want to tell you something. Any way we do this, we're going to run into one specific issue, and that is our exit point. Remember that rotation? That bit's going to be turning clockwise. It's going to cut in here, so it's going to give us a nice shear. It's going to do fine coming down, particularly on the end grain. But right here where it exits, it's going to try to chip that edge out. So what can you do? There's two things. One is you can actually, on your straight edge, attach a caul that will prevent any chip out on the back side. That's a good idea. The second thing you can do is to score it. Take a sharp knife, a thin saw, whatever the case, and make a cut. That's so that when it exits, it's already, the wood is cut out here. Now, if you're using this technique to cut an entire panel and you're cutting the flat grain sides, that chip out thing, it can be pretty significant sometimes. So remember that bump cut? Don't forget that. All right, let's take a look at this real quick. Now remember that sneak up on it thing. Now there's an alternative to this, and I could use the same technique. I could use a bottom bearing spiral cut. And I could have flipped this over, and by running on this edge, I could have cut the whole edge. Okay, in that case, I want a down cut spiral, which is what I have. Another alternative is I could use a guide and just a straight bit. Now, the thing you want I want to talk about this very briefly. A lot of you guys use plywoods and these kind of things, and again, trying to cut these big massive panels out of plywood is just a bear. Especially in small shops and areas you just don't have room to wrestle with them. This is called a compression bit. Kind of an odd looking animal. You'll notice the big tooth out here on the corner. What is a compression bit predominantly designed for? Cutting, period. It's what it's made to do. It's made to be buried into something and cut. They use these all the time in CNC for cutting out panels. Now, using a guide and using a straight edge, and I wanted to show you this as soon as I move this. This is one of those that just clamps across. You can use this to actually cut your plywood. Works really nice. Compression bit, that's what it's for. A compression bit is neither upcut nor downcut. It's designed somewhere in the middle, and it's a completely different configuration. And it's not designed for mortises or anything. It's designed to cut in between two pieces of wood. And, you know, cutting out panels or whatever, and particularly if you're doing something where you're doing a lot of repetitive panels and everything's got to be exactly the same, to make you a template and take this and use to cut them, everything's going to be identical. Now, in this case, what we did was we ran the bearing along the edge. Now, one nice thing to have on that is a large plate. That gives us a good, steady bearing surface here on the back to keep us straight. But there is an alternative. And depending upon the length of your bit, we can simply move this back and we can index off of the edge of our router plate. Not a big deal. And just like this, where we've got a partial cut, all I got to do is set it up, and now running off of my already cut edge, finish the cut out. Not a big deal. Now again, this is one of those that clamps over the wood, does a nice job. Big panels, cutting, the common sense says you want to make sure everything's square before you route it. But dealing with large panels and things that's hard to cut would really is a nice way to do it. All right, guys. Hey, a lot of you guys, and I know because I've had you come through my shop and you're always telling me how you like the D handles. And, you know, I really like them. I mean, I'm not trying to sell you on the D handle. I told you I like D handles. But, you know, since you spent all your money buying my DVDs, well, you spent all your money buying my DVDs. What can you do? Well, you can make one. I mean, this is about a no-brainer. And but I'm going to tell you about it. I did this real quick just to show you. Remember that hole we drilled? I just took a piece of 1/4-inch plywood. Now I'm going to tell you, 1/4-inch plywood does not do this. It's too flimsy. See right here? It'll break. And I actually took a staple gun and just shot this handle on here to show it to you. Don't want to do that either. Anyway, the best thing to make your handle out of would be a really good piece of plywood. And on the base, you know, a good piece of polycarbonate, a good piece of 1/4-inch plexiglass would do well. But one of the things I didn't do when I was thinking about it, and I've done this before and I knew better, is you want to cut a notch right here. Little notch right there, and you want this to come up over this housing. And then, and the reason I say plywood, this is MDF, is you want to be able to run a screw up in there and something's going to hold really well. You don't want to use solid wood. If you do, the grain's going to be running this direction or either way, and you kind of got a situation where it could break on you. So a good plywood, a little piece of plexiglass, you got a D-handle router. Simple as that. And if some of you guys out there are Sparkies, I guess you'd figure out how to put the switch, but that ain't a big deal. All right. Circles and wheels. What in the world? Well, you know, when you're doing, you know, routers, one of the things routers really do really well is to help us create all kind of nice flowing shapes and replicate patterns and all of that, and you're going to see all of that. But to make the pattern and to deal with things in whether you want to enlarge them or whether you want to, you know, make them smaller, whatever you want to do, a lot of times the thing you want to do is make a mirror image of something. An example would be if this is just part of an ellipse, but that has nothing to do with nothing. But if I wanted to make a piece of wood that was exactly the same width and follow this pattern, how would I do it? Now, we've all seen taking, you know, there's a lot of stuff out here, and they'll tell you, you know, a lot of people will tell you to take a compass and come around. That does semi-okay. The problem with that is that if you vary in any way, you're going to be off. You have to stay perfectly 90 degrees to whatever you're doing. And some of the moldings and some of the different things that you may be making make it kind of complicated. The answer is always a circle. Big ones, fat ones, little ones, skinny, it doesn't matter. As long as it's a circle and you can get a hole in the middle, it does it. A circle will constantly and consistently always track. A circle or a wheel, whatever you want to call it, it will track perfectly every time. Something as simple as a washer, you know, you can go to the hardware store and buy a huge array of washers. It will constantly and get down on the thing. It will constantly and always track correctly. Anything, an insert from a router lift. You can make big wheels, little wheels. Doesn't matter. It will consistently and constantly track it. Sometimes you might want a big molding. When you do a wheel, think about how you're going to mark it. In this case, what I'm doing is when I hold this pencil in right against this edge. So when I do my measurement, I'm going to measure from the edge of the circle or the edge of the center hole out to my edge to get my measurement. If I had something that I was going down dead through the center, it'd be different. Here's a commercial one that's made, and you notice it goes right down through the center. That's what I'm talking about. But a circle wheel will always help you to create a mirror image of whatever it is you're doing. Cutting a circle using a router. Now in this case, we're using a router table. Here's a quick, easy jig for you. Now what this is, I want you to check out what I'm doing here. I've got a platform right here. Down here, I got a 1/4 inch dowel. Right here, I got a 1/4 inch carriage bolt. What's a carriage bolt? It's one of those, got that square end on it with the round head like that. Simply set into the bottom here. Now this arm, all it's got to have is a flat side right here. Center point. Now this isn't real critical, guys. And the radius, you'll see why that's there in a moment. And I routed a slot. So this arm can move. Now the reason we've got the bolt here and not just a regular dowel is we want some resistance, and you'll see that in a moment. Now this happens to be screwed down to my router table. And I realize a lot of you guys don't want to screw something to your router table. But I will tell you this much, having a router table that you can screw jigs onto and do all of this and do all of that, it's a pretty neat thing. When mine gets, now this one's made out of a big old solid core door. And I don't even remember where I got it now, but it makes for a nice one. But this is one of those feather boards you can buy out here, but pretty much anywhere. They're not real expensive. But on the bottom of it, it's got these nylon tabs that go down into your miter slot. And the cool thing with them is that they will tighten up. They form a wedge, and they'll lock down into your miter slot, so you don't have to screw into your into your router table. So that's an alternative for you. And you can use the magnets if you got a metal one, or just simply make your platform large enough to clamp it. Here's the way this thing works. Here's the circle, 1/4 inch hole in the middle, rough cut on the bandsaw. Now this is just 1/4 inch plywood, because all I'm making here is a circle that's a specific width to use to lay out or to mirror image a pattern. So this isn't a critical thing. But I do want some resistance. Now, you're going to hear me all the way through this series tell you rotation is important. This bit, if we turn it on, this bit is turning in this direction. So I want to be feeding against it, not with it. If I feed in this direction, this bit's going to want to try to grab this and spin it. Not a good thing. So I want to feed against it, but I want a little bit of resistance. That's all this is about. Now sometimes I'll put another nut on here and tighten the wing nut up against it just to give me a little bit more, because the problem is my rotation is going to try to loosen me up a little bit as I turn. But I'll be okay here. Now, what I can do is I can start up keeping resistance here, but I don't want it super loose. I want to be able to move it without it. And all I got to do is ease into my rotating bit until I get to my line. Let's take a look, and then we rotate it. Let's take a look. Now, I hope you saw why we wanted the other nut, okay? Keeps it from the vibration or whatever, keeps it from backing off. You also saw why I have the radius here, because I'm able to turn it. Now, this other little jig I showed you, it's the exact same thing, just different size. Another way of doing this is using the same, but because it was a router, I wanted to show it with. And what I'm using here is just simply a spiral cut bit. It's a down cut, but I'm cutting 1/4 inch plywood. I can use it on a bandsaw, and a neat place to do it is to use it on a sander, a disc sander. They work really nice. Now you can cut fairly small on this, but when you start getting down close, then you start getting unsafe. You're getting too close to the bit. So a trick is to simply drill yourself, because this is being used strictly for a pattern, it's not going to matter if it has a hole in it. Drill yourself another hole in it, take your little 1/4-inch dowel, stick in it, and use it to rotate your circle. Circles on a router, pretty easy. Now while I'm here, I'm going to show you how I cut this slot. Kind of hard to take a screw out with a drill bit. All right, here's what I did. Well, if you want to know the truth, really what I did, I'm going to show you. Lowered my bit down. And I drilled a hole in my router table, and I set this over top of it at a pivot point. Set this where I wanted it, turned my router on, and I cranked it up. When it came up through, I went zzz, and I cut the hole. But I'm going to assume you don't have a router lift that you can crank up like that. Most don't. And to have that bit turning and reach under and loosen a router and try to crank it up, that's not very safe. So what else can you do? Well, it's actually pretty easy. If you want something that's perfect, then what you want to do is drill your hole, drill you a hole, drill you a start and a stop hole if you can. Then, creating yourself a pivot point. Now this is just kind of a show thing. Creating yourself a pivot point. Now you would want a block of wood under here because you don't want this doing this number. Start, again, mind your rotation. And bring that bit up, okay, and make sure that that bit is able to be free in the hole. It's not really tight. Now, what I normally will do, if I want a 1/4-inch slot, I will actually drill my start hole at 5/16 to make sure that I can start that bit without it engaging the wood. Then the same thing will apply. A better pivot point is a bolt, just like we showed you, because you want that resistance. If you have the resistance in here, it's going to keep this thing from getting out of control on you. Again, I emphasize, make sure the bit is not engaging the wood. Okay? This would be clamped down or secure, and I simply move it to where I want. Simple as that. Now, I could go through a lot and show you, but I think you're getting the premise of this now, so I can explain this. I can also go out here, let's say I've got a round table and I want to router cut it, or I'm going to cut a pattern to use to cut the round pattern. It's just a matter of how far out I get, okay? Same thing will apply. Cut your circle. And as you will see when we do the pie crust table, you can also cut a round top. You can use, by incrementing in, you can cut designs in it and you can hollow it out. It's just a matter of keep rotating and making sure your bit depth and everything is set right. Now I hope that didn't confuse you, okay? Because it's a simple matter, again, of selecting the right bit and setting it up. And as you've heard me tell you all the way through this, the biggest thing with a router is the bit selection, rotation, and figuring out how you're going to guide it. That's the biggest thing. Again, a router is nothing more than a motor spinning a bit. In this case, it's mounted in a table, and the handheld, well, that's obvious. And that's how it amounts to. But this works really, really well. Okay? So now we have a circle. Now, one of the things with the circle that we talked about earlier is this is going to have a lot to do, again, with the instrument that you use to mark with. If you're using a pencil and you've got a 1/4 inch hole and the pencil goes way down, then you're dead center as long as you can get it in here. Or you have to compensate and go to the edge of the hole, right here, like you do on the washer. So, when you're laying out your circle, it's going to depend upon whether you're typically going to be indexing from this edge to this. So if it's a 1/4 of an inch, listen to what I'm going to tell you. If it's a 1/4 of an inch, and you want this point to this point to be 2 3/4, make your center point 2 7/8. Because when you drill it, the 1/4 inch, you're going to be stepping in 1/8 of an inch. You'll only get it wrong once, and then you'll understand what I'm telling you. Making circles. All right, guys. Thin, small, narrow pieces. Routing. They're tough. There's no ifs, ands, and buts. And if you're not careful, you're going to, well, you can do some damage to some fingers. Here's some tips. I took a Forstner bit. This is just simply a round over, as an example. And I took a Forstner bit and I drilled it. This one's just a hair big. Normally I like to drill it to whatever the outside of the bit is. Absolutely to give me as much bearing surface as I can get. If you have a fence that you can control well, here's another thing. We'll call this a zero insert. If you have a fence that will let you move in comfortably, get back here, boy, then you can simply drill a hole that's about the size of the bearing. Just enough your bearing comes through just well. And what you actually do is just drill half a hole. So keep your Forstner bit, the point, just enough that it'll guide you. And the best way to do that's a drill press. Then with your router on, you can create almost a zero insert. And on really, really teeny small pieces, it's a good idea. Then I'm just simply taking a straight edge here and coming back and setting it right to my bearing. Now, here's one way. Just a simple set of cabinet maker's clamps. This is the piece I want to route, and by putting 2 cawls on the outside, this gives me more of a bearing surface. Here's your problem. On really narrow something, the problem is going to be that, number one, you can't hold it safely. Number two, it's going to try to get inside. And in a lot of cases, you're not going to have a bearing surface. So what this does is simply set it to your fence. Make sure everything's nice and square and tight. Now you can try the over-the-head clamp like this, but normally like that. But what you're going to find is that they have a tendency on thin stuff. They have a tendency for the cawls right here to twist up. You want something that's going to let you lay flat. Then route it. The other thing this is going to do is this makes these cawls at each side of it keep you from chipping out. And you get a nice clean cut. Now, by the same token, if I were doing this, what I would try to do, and let's assume for a minute I need some really short pieces. Say I wanted this to be a 1/2 inch long, I wouldn't even attempt to route it. I just wouldn't do it. What I would do would be take a longer piece just like this, route both sides and my end like we just did, then I would go through and cut. I would route both sides. Let's look at it. Let's just do it. Now I want you to notice the fence is doing the guiding, not the bearing. See, I'm below the bearing, and that's what I'm showing you. That's where your fence. Now I can go using either my chop saw, using my miter slide, whatever, to my saw, and I can cut this end off using my clamp again, come back, do the other end, and keep incrementing back. That's the safest way to do it. And the piece I just routed, the one I just did, just showed you. Common sense says you should have a push stick to have done that. That's the safe way to do it. Do what I say, don't do what I did. And I will tell you this, that what's safe for me is oftentimes not safe for you. I've been at this a while. Narrow, long pieces. And these usually come into play when you're out here doing something like like doors and whatever, where you're doing mullions in the doors, and, narrow moldings and whatever. They're hard to deal with, okay? You can make you one of these any length, width, whatever. This is so simple. You got to stop. Piece of wood sets in here. I can push down. I can push in. Now see, I could take this and make it all the way out. I could put another handle on it. That's what will guide you. It does nice. Now, I could go through all of this and make a dowel for you, using the exact same setup, using your clamp. To make a dowel, cut your piece of wood square. Take a round over bit. If you've got a 3/4 inch, you want a 3/4 inch dowel. Take you a 3/4 inch piece of wood. Take you a 3/8 radius round over bit. Your bearing is going to hit right dead in the center. Okay, guys, making a dowel. If you will take a 3/4, in this case I've got a 3/4 by 3/4. This is the same old stick I use, but anyway. And a 3/8 radius round over. I actually think I got a little smaller than that, but half of whatever you want. If you want an inch dowel, then you want a 1/2 inch radius round over. Same exact setup as we have here. And run it. Now here's going to be your problem, is the last cut. They have a tendency to want to roll and twist on you a little bit. You don't want that. So here's a trick. Yeah, I got a 5/16 instead of a 3/8 radius. I didn't bother to change bits. But you get the point. Use the 3/8. And don't route the whole end off. Make your dowel a little longer so you can cut it off. And by leaving that little end square, and then what it does is it's going to keeps it from rotating on you. Okay guys, if you're doing thin, narrow stuff, here's a good idea. What I've got is, this is just an old scrap, obviously. But what I did is I took a piece of wood that's the same thickness, and I've got it on the back side of it, and I've got it clamped securely. Here's the reason, is that when I'm holding this router, I've got a good back bearing surface. I don't have this wobble. I can move this way, but my hand pressure is going to be over here. And I can control it better. I've got that bearing surface. Now, that's important. Because it gives me control. Is there anything else I can do? Yes. Now the reason we're going through all of this, and a lot of you guys know this, but there's a lot of you who don't, is, and I know everybody out there has run into trouble. If you've used a router at all, you've run into trouble with the router wanting to tilt or wobble on you. And trying to make really heavy cuts, particularly in narrow stock, is predominantly one of the major things that occur. Here's what else you can do. Take a couple blocks of wood that are the same thickness as what you're doing. A little double-faced tape. Another reason I kind of like the bigger bases is I can stick it on, and I can do one on both sides. And by setting this up, you see exactly what I would get. Now, obviously, I would clamp this down. Now, I've eliminated the router's ability to rock. And I can scoot on down through there. Smart routing. That makes it safe, like I said, and wiggling around. Okay, guys, we've talked about how we guide a router in handheld, using a guide, using a fence, using a guide attached to the router, bearings, the whole deal. But those have to guide against something. And where we saw the little piece there, you know, doing just an edge treatment where it runs against the wood, you know, that's pretty simple. But we can use routers to shape things and to make various different shapes, pattern cutting. But to make a pattern, to do pattern cutting, you have to make a pattern. This is some 3/4 MDF. MDF makes great patterns. If you're going to have something more permanent, where you're going to be making a lot of them, you might want to consider something like some plexiglass or just a good heavy plastic. But, you know, in this case where I've got a pencil line here, I've got to work to it. I've bandsawed it close. Now, if you've got one of the oscillating sanders that you can lay this on and shape it, that's wonderful. They are probably one of the best ways of doing it. But oftentimes, that doesn't work. But here's an issue with that you have. And the issue is if to take sandpaper, rasp, and all of that, and make this surface perfectly parallel, well, it can be kind of tough. And if you're doing this and you get an angle on your pattern, you have an issue. Let's take a look at an alternative. All I'm going to do right now is work myself down to my line on about the outside 1/8 of an inch. Okay, I'm down pretty close. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do here. Now, to make sure that I'm good and stable, I'm just going to lay another piece in here. And I'm going to lock all of this. And the reason I've got the other piece back here is, again, that support thing. And I'm overhanging my bench, so I want to make sure that I'm down good and secure. All right, here's what I've got. Remember that little bearing I showed you in the beginning that had the two? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set this is a flush trim. And I'm going to set it to where I've got about 1/8 of an inch of the bearing surface. Now remember, all I did here was just work the top 1/8 of an inch. And I'm real close to my line. I left a little bit. By indexing off the top 1/8 of an inch and staying flat on this, I now have, my sides are now nice and straight. But it will net, now the reason you notice I showed you that had 2 bearings. I don't need 2 bearings. But you see what I've got. Now I've got a little line right here. And that's because my bearing was actually running right there. All right, so what can I do? I flip it over, lock it in, just rerun it. Now this time, what was my original top, like I said, I just flipped it so that it's on the bottom. Now I have a nice smooth pattern to index off of. Now I'd probably take a little 220 and just lightly sand that, because that bearing is going to, it's going to pick up anything. So a nice smooth edge is imperative. You know, and I understand this. Sometimes it don't always go perfect and you mess up your pattern. You get a little lump or you get something in there. Is there anything you can do to fix it? Yeah. Now, I've seen guys use epoxy and I've seen them use wood filler. And it's all okay, I guess. Wood filler is a little soft. Best thing you can use, fastest, easiest, a little auto body filler. Works like a champ. Sets up quick, creates a good surface, and you're on up the street. Hey guys, you know, veneers. Now, I know some of you use them, some of you don't. But you know, one of the hardest things in the world to do is to cut veneers, and straight line veneers particularly. Well, I grabbed a couple pieces of veneer here. I think this is a lace wood or something. I'm going to show you a trick. All I've got is, as you can see, it's some MDF. And 2 straight edges. I put my veneer in between them, sandwiched them down. Now underneath here, I prefer to kind of let it go a little longer than my veneer is so I can pop a screw in each end without damaging the veneer. You can do this on an end grain. You can do it on a flat grain. It just doesn't matter. And using one of these spiral cut router bits. Now, some guys like the straight ones. I prefer the spiral. Using the spiral cut. Now I'm going to have to be reaching over so you can see the cut. You see that chip out? That was there before I started. And I didn't take enough off to take it out. But as you can well see, veneer seam. And you know, you can set them up to where you can cut your little pie-shaped wedges. You can cut them, you can do multiple cuts, multiple pieces. Really, really does work nice. Somebody's going to ask me a down shear, up shear on them. I prefer a down shear. Because again, that shear is coming downward and it discharges the chips through the bottom. And by cutting downward, it gives you a cleaner edge. Okay guys, what we're going to look at is fluting. And what fluting is where there's a little rounded bottom groove cut. And it doesn't have to be rounded, but it looks nice. And one of the places you should identify it with is in what's called quarter columns. What's a quarter column? You've looked at a dresser or something, and on each side of it, you see where the corner steps in, and there's a little turning at the top and bottom, and then running down the corner is these carved flutes or lines carved into an oval corner inset into it. That's a quarter column. Now, most of you know this, but in case you don't, I'm going to tell you about it. The way you do a quarter column is you simply take 4 pieces of wood and you glue them up into a square that you then later turn. Now, the reason you want the 4 pieces is that you've got to be able to separate them later, because you only want a quarter of it. You only want this much of it right here, 1/4. So the easiest way to do that is when you glue it up, go sparingly with the glue, and in between it, put something like this is craft paper, brown paper bag, or whatever. Now the reason for that is that allows you then to be able to get in here with a chisel and pop all of this apart. Okay, so you don't have to saw it. So each circle is going to make us 4 corners. Now typically when you see these, there's what's called a capital. Now these are a little larger than normal, but I did that so you could see it. And a capital is glued the same way, then turned. It usually has a square top. That completes the top of the corner. And what it does is it simply sets on top, and the read it portion goes in between. Now, one of the things you want to do when you do that, you always want your capital in your transition to give you a defined, in other words, don't try to bring this flush. Give it a defined transition. And a way of doing that is simply finish it off in a little bead or something that actually will sit proud of your column. But what we're going to look at is how do we flute it. Now, one of the first things we have to do is we have to lay it out. And while this isn't necessarily about the router, it's good stuff, I hope. Take a piece of paper and go all the way around it. And cut it so that it's the exact length of your circumference. Then mark it on each corner of your quarter. Take that distance. Now what I usually do is I start in the center. Then I divide it out. If I wind up having a little narrower point right here on each, what will be the corner of the quarter column, it works itself out. Now, you don't want to flute right in the corner. Now, what you have to think about though is in this case, what we're using is I'm using a little 1/4-inch box core bit. I think it's 1/4, 3/16, whatever it is. So when you do the column, what you want is you want to flute, flat spot, flute, flat spot. So this is laid out in about 3/8 increments. And each line is going to be my center point for fluting it. Now when I flute it here and I flute it here, then here and here, that's going to give me about 1/8 of an inch raised portion in between each groove. Now you'll see that. Okay? Now let's look at the jig. Now this jig is used for simply doing what's called a through. In other words, we're just going to flute it all the way through. Now all this is a box. Forget about this top in it for the moment, this groove top. It's a box. Some MDF, shot it together with some brad nails and staples. Now, and this box fits over top of this. Now, I'm not real loose in here. I want it to fit pretty snug. Now, here's the object of the game. This little piece of MDF that's stapled on the end is a center line. This is straight. This is the center of my opening, which will translate to the center of my turning. It's a gauge, nothing more. And what I can do is line this up, then simply with a small clamp, put a little pressure on the sides of my jig, and I'm held fast. My piece isn't going to be turning. Now that's the reason you want to make sure that this is pretty snug in here. Okay, you don't want to be blowing your sides out, but you want to be snug. Now, the reason I've got them that work against my fence and whatever. And even though this board is clamped to a fence, it doesn't have to be. You can clamp just the board down, you can screw it down, do whatever you want. You want a nice long guide. Now here's one of the things one of the reasons for that is sometimes when you clamp this, what will happen is your sides at the top can kind of pull in. So you want to make sure that that's not an issue. Okay? But if you have a little space in here where it's pinched, where it runs against the fence, let me show you that. It's not a big deal. See right here where it's a little. Now the reason that's not a big deal is because I've got enough length back here and forward that I'm going to be indexing off of my two front points, which will be straight. Now the other thing I'm going to do is I want to make sure that my bit is set dead center. And that's a simple matter of just eyeball it and make sure you're in the middle of where you want to be. Not a big deal. Set your height. Don't try to get these things really deep. Typically, 1/8, 3/16 is more than enough. Okay, let's take a look at the cut. Now here's our flute. One flute. Now all we have to do is keep rotating. Okay. This is how, now notice right here, now this is my outer edge, okay, right here. Now I did this because I want to show you something. If you get really tight on your edge, this is what you get. So pay real close attention to your layout. Be very, very particular in how you do this because you don't want something looking like that. See what I'm showing you? So be very particular. Now I'll give you another hint. Turning you a little scrap stock to play with to get your spacing, okay, is a really, really smart thing to do. Now, you can see the look you're getting. Now the other thing you can do is depending upon the depth, because it's a cove, is going to depend upon a little bit how much width you're keeping here. Again, having a little practice, just a little piece that you've turned, same circumference, to test your setup is smart. All right, now let's look at a way of doing what's called a stopped flute. Same jig. Now the only thing I got is I got a slot cut in the top. Same exact alignment point. You can see this is high. I don't think I got to explain this. This is keeping it from turning, holding it down. Got a plunge router. got a guide on it. I think this one's 5/8 or whatever it is. Same bit. Now to get your depth, before I forget, is to come back here and put your router bit. Now when I say come back here, what I'm after is I'm sitting on top of this and my bit's able to come down past the back so I can see exactly how far it's going into the wood. Or you can just simply let the bit touch the wood and then adjust your stop accordingly. Now to make this, all I do is you got two pieces of wood, in this case again the MDF, and you cut up another piece that's the width of your bushing so that it will, and then you just glue it in as a spacer basically between the two, and that gives you your slot. Now depending upon the length of your spacer here is going to be where your stop points are at, and you can just work that out to suit yourself. Now, I'll give you a tip. MDF, if when you first cut it and you holding this together and your guide fits tight, you better clamp it, because if you don't, what I found is that it seems like when you clamp MDF and glue it, your slot will get too tight. Just a quick tip. Outside of that, it's hit it and go. I do want to mention one last thing. This is a little thicker. One of the things that you're going to find with a lot of these small box core bits is they're pretty short. So on your top piece right here, I usually like to make this out of 1/2 inch rather than the 3/4, just because of that very reason. Just for bit. And stop loop. No harder than that. Now over when we do the where we're reading the bedpost, you can also use the same technique in that we're going to be doing there as you can on this. In other words, the same exact setup and technique will work to do this, in which case it's being done on a lathe. All right, guys, read and post. I ain't talking about the newspaper. I'm talking about reed, R-E-E-D. What we got here, this is a rig, and all we got is a laminate trimmer, bolted, clamped, screwed, glued, ever how you want to do it, and I don't screw your laminate trimmer to it. And we have a reading bit. Now, here's the way this thing works. Here's a reading bit. And essentially what happens is we're going down through here on this post. This is running in one groove, and that's the reason you see two bearings. It's indexing off of the points. Now I'm going to give you a hint. Now I'm going to tell you how to lay it out very, very quickly. Basically divide it into, let's say, double the increment of whatever your radius is. In other words, if this is a 1/4 inch, lay it off in 1/2 inch increments. Close as you can. And what you want to index off of is your smallest point, the end of the post. Simply put a piece of paper around it and divide it in to about a half. Now, when I say that, there's some calculations you can do, but that's bedpost stuff. I want to teach you how to read it. Now, the same thing down here on the urn part. Now, in order to get it laid out and to get a straight line running all the way down this so we know where to increment from, on your lathe, your live center or your spur center, that's the one that drives it. Simply take you a really fancy L. Set it on the bed of your lathe, bump it up to the spur center. It's going to mark your center of it, drill you a hole that a pencil will go through. With this between the two centers and your layout line up here, lock it in place, take it down. Now my lathe has what's called an indexing head. Means I can lock it at different levels going around. A lot of lathes don't have that. Here's a quick easy jig. Doing the same thing, marking the center. Drill a hole that your tenon will fit in, or the base of your post, or whatever it is you're doing. Have it go through, again, a bolt. You just made a clamp. Bolt this to the lathe base, or clamp it to the lathe base rather. Let this go in, lock it, loosen it, rotate, do the same thing. All right, now back to this jig. One of the things that you want this to extend over the bottom of your lathe pretty nice. And because when you get your router in here, it's a little heavy this way. So at a good sized base, and I've actually glued a brick on them or anything just to give me a little weight so that I stay nice and straight. Now on the end of it, always make your post a little longer if you can. And the reason is you saw where the live center is coming in here, and what will happen if not, you can hit the end of your live center. Now down here, once we've done the fluting part, this is a simple little chisel cleanup and some quick sanding. Read it post. Okay, what you want to do, here's a suggestion, and I suggest it big time, is turn you some scrap post or a scrap post. Play with it a little bit. Get the feel for it. All right, it's not difficult at all. It's really not difficult. But just getting a feel for it. Now in this case, we used a 1/4 inch radius bit. You can get them in, I think, 5/16, 3/8, and half. That's a pretty good size post. So, but in order to get, when you have a 1/4 inch radius, on the end of it's going to be the critical part. When you have a 1/4 inch radius, here's what I want you to think about. You've got a 1/4 coming this way and a 1/4 coming this way. If you lathe it, and because you're going to be dishing out this little bit of area right there, it's also going to make, what's going to create your bead correctly. But even if you don't do nothing but just turn the diameter, that's the same as the top of your post, and play with your router just a little bit. Okay, to make sure your positioning and everything is going to give you but down here where it widens out, that's not a big issue. But you do want this to come into a nice floral looking. You want all your beads, to be nice and even. All right, that's reading a post. Now, remember we did the 1/4 column and did the exact same thing using a fluting bit. Okay, remember when we did the 1/4 column, we used a little 1/4 inch bullnose or box core bit. This is actually what's called a fluting bit for doing that and doing it on the lathe, exactly as we did it here. Okay? Now, a lot of you guys will maybe buy a post from some of the folks who make them and you decide you want to read it because you don't have a lathe. That's okay. You can build a jig, and I'm just going to touch this. You can all you got to do is simply build you anything that you can set that post between equal distance, equal height to the center. To the center. In other words, the center of this and the center of this is setting equal distance. And if you've got something like your bench or a nice flat level surface that you can hold this between and not have it turning, you've got it. The applications to reading, fluting are endless. And it's just a fun thing to do and a fun thing to know how to do. All right, guys. One of the things I want to tell you about too is we've looked at making base plates out of plywood, plexiglass, whatever you want. And we've talked about using the guides as, you know, for routing and whatever. And I'm going to tell you this now. Most of your guides, it seems like each different router company kind of has their own specific set of guides. Predominantly, the industry and that's fine. If you've got a Freud or you've got a Makita or a Bosch or whatever it is, then buy the guides, of course, to fit your router. The dominant set of guides out there are designed to fit the Porter cable. You'll see that everywhere. And if that's the case and you got a set of Porter cable guides and you got a Freud router like this, and you can see Freud has a large opening in this big plunge that is used to, they have different inserts that go into it. And, you know, this isn't going to fit in that. Well, we've already looked at a way of making a base and finding the dead center. And if you have a router that's not centering, you can make your own base, again, by using something in the collet, either a center finder or whatever you're using to make sure you can find true center. Then simply take a Forstner bit, drill the large diameter first, which is going to be the outside of your bushing here, and a smaller one, and drill out the center. Now remember to do the big one first, because when you drill the big one, the point is going to leave a mark to show you dead center, so that when you come back and drill out the inside, it's a no-brainer. And then just simply attach your guide. Very, very simple. All right, let's take a look very quick. This is a segment where we're going to look at guides and a different thing, and we're also going to look at inlays because they go hand in hand here. Now here's a setup that's out on the market today. You've seen them. And what this is it uses a 1/8 of an inch. Let me get this where you can see. It uses an 1/8 inch upcut or downcut, I forget, spiral bit. Some of them use a double flute. I like the spiral. Then it has one size, which is a 1/4 inch guide, and then it has a 3/8 or 1/2 inch, whatever's bigger. Yeah, 1/2 inch. Because what it does is you cut using the large outside guide. Then removing it, you can cut an inlay that you're going to inlay to it using the smaller. And what it winds up doing is it's an 1/8 of an inch difference, which is the same diameter as the bit, and you get a perfect inlay. Now, what I've done, This happens to be a butterfly template, and there's a lot of people make them. Big ones, fat ones, little ones, whatever. And so I'm going to do one here just so you get an idea. But before I do it, I want to tell you, you can make whatever pattern you want. I remember once I had a big old walnut table, 2 big huge boards, gorgeous things. Book matched, but on each side I had a really bad knot. Bad knot. And I knew that filling it just wasn't going to be a good option. I found a piece of wood, I found another thing that had a really nice knot in it. I cut me a kind of an irregular hole, and using this in something and laid it down over top, and then using what we're going to do first, I cut out the majority of the knot, down about 1/4 inch. Then using the good knot, I made me a template doing exactly what we're getting ready to do, and inlaid it in there, and it was beautiful. It came out great. Again, it's for inlays. You can take this little bit, 1/8 inch bit with just this guide, make yourself patterns, do string inlay, anything you want. But let's take a look at it. Now the first cut is made with the large bushing on. Now you got an 1/8 inch spiral bit. It's solid carbide. Don't horse this. Take light cuts. Going just a hair deeper. Now the object of my game here was to not only cut my pattern, but to hollow out and take all the center out. If I get a little extra, I can always clean it up with a chisel. Then what I do, using my exact same pattern, I come back and I make my reverse. I make my actual inlay. Now, here's a trick. Make your inlay out of some, relatively thin stock. This is about 5/16 or something. And what I do is once I've cut it, you see how deep I've cut it? Now I can either, what I do is just take a thin stock, then bandsaw, leaving the line around it, and I just simply glue it into place, sand it off. Now to make the actual inlay, what you want to do is go to remove the outer bearing, or bushing rather, and do the same thing. But like I said, you want to cut it a little deeper. Now, when you do this, be very careful and stay just on the outside edge. Let's take a look. This is my inlay. Now, one of the things you can buy, you can make your own, you can buy stars, you can buy circles, you can buy about any kind of pattern that you want. But one of the things when you're making your own pattern is try to, see this little radius in the corner? When you're making a pattern, if you cut that in a little radius, you'll notice what it does. The bushing, because it's able to go into a rounded corner, will wind up cutting a straight line. So drilling your corners, then sawing and working to them is a smart thing to do. And you'll notice what it did is it gave me nice, clean, straight corners. Glue it in place, sand it off, and you have an inlay. All right, now we're gonna look at another way of doing inlays. Now, like I said, you can take this and do all kind of string inlays and then make your string and do it. And you can also get 1/16 of an inch bits. Now this is a ready-made store-bought inlay. Just a demo. It's 3/8 of an inch wide. Okay, here's where using a nice guide. Outside guide helps. Now, on a scrap of wood, make sure you set your depth, because depth in this is pretty critical. But I'm just going to kind of guess it here. Now, this is a nice guide system, and almost all the routers out there have some form of thereof. And this is the one that uses the bars that come in and is attached. You can also put a sacrificial fence on it. You know, you could make a plywood base for your router and simply glue or screw a piece across it, anything to make you a guide. Then, by simply making your cut, and what you're going to have to do is square your corner. Now, one thing I didn't do here was I should have drawn where I wanted to go so that I could tell my router stop. Always chisel your corner lightly. You know, then simply inlay, glue your inlay. Possibilities are endless. Again, the same thing with the router. I'll repeat it over and over and over again. Rotation, bit, and how you drive it. Those are the 3 keys to a router. All right, guys. Now I'm going to show you this thing. Now, what do you call it? Well, I don't know. It's a thingamajig. Or whatchamacallit. A doohickey. It's one of them. Before I get to it, I want to, in our last little thing when we was using the wheel on the router base that we made, and I just drilled a small hole in the middle. One of the things I noticed when I was taking it apart was that this hole was clogging up with the dust from the MDF. Of course, it didn't have any vacuum on it. And one of the things that I always do when I'm just using it to route and I'm not using it for a guide is I like a large hole in the center. Now, I cut this one just with a hole saw. But we showed you earlier, and I'm going to try to get a little segment in here and show you the cutter that goes on a drill press. But anyway, what I'm telling you is drill that center hole out bigger. It really helps with the chip removal and keeping your cut clean. The other thing I want to tell you about is that I've emphasized, I think, enough in this DVD that wheels, you know, you can take a wheel and take this pattern and make it larger. You can actually take a pattern this size, and if you make a big wheel, you can take it and make a big table. You absolutely can. But there's a trick when you do that, and I've done that, is when you do that, because you've got a big wheel, and if you're using 1/4-inch plywood, sometimes the plywood, you know, it don't set down perfectly flat. Once you've made your pattern, come back and cut you out something and attach something over top of it so that your wheel, when it's running, it has something over top of it to keep it from being able to kick up off. And you can take small patterns and make big things out of them. Just depends on how big a wheel you want to make. Now, speaking of wheels, when we just did this, the gooseneck, you saw all the different steps we went through. And after I did that, I got to thinking. And sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's not. But I kept thinking about being able to cut that gooseneck from the top, rather than having to go through the little router and, you know, the trim router and going through all of that stuff. Now I'm leaving it in the DVD because it's a lot of applications that you can use it on. But I got to tell you, now that I've thought of this is a whole lot better. I'm going to show it to you. Here's what I did. I simply took an amount of, here's the jig. Now, a lot of routers will have a place for a guide to be attached. And they've got the holes run through the base. But normally on those, guides are usually 1/4 to 5/16, and they usually don't go all the way through. Now there's a couple things you could do here. But what I've got here is I simply took a piece of 1/4-inch plywood and I made me a base, as you can well see. Screwed it to my router, just basically like we just did. The only difference was that I made sure that it stuck out about 1.5 inches, 2 inches on each side. Then what I did was on my table saw. Now this is 3/8 threaded rod. What I did was I just took I think these are about 1.25 inches. And on my table saw, by running them, I just plowed out a little groove. Didn't even use the dado, just a blade, to where my rod would fit through. Just made a channel. Then I screwed it and I glued it to the base. Just a tunnel that this rod could fit through. All right. Now the nuts and bolts are obvious. Now, I tell you what else I could do after thinking about this, is I could have used some 1/2-inch threaded rod and probably used one of those, a stock collar on it, so I didn't have all these bolts. Or so I could have used some wing nuts to make it a little easier, but you can do that. I want you to understand the jig. Then, out here, as you can see, it's just simply 2 vertical pieces, and then attached to the bottom is that. Then to that, I drilled it, put a 1/4-inch dowel in it, made me some wheels out of plywood, and put them over it. Then I took a little 1/4-inch stop, router bit collar, and put on it just to keep my wheels from being able to move up and down. Now, again, hindsight, I could have made this a little heavier maybe and did it with a carriage bolt. A lot of different ways I could have secured this. I could have used a 1/2-inch dowel, drilled it from the side, and put a little 1/8-inch dowel through it. I just want my wheel to not be able to move up and down. And I could have got some large bearings and used a large bearing in here. Whatever you want to do. But here's the point. Here's what it does. Okay? Is by having the dual wheels. Okay? Here's the gist. What this does, remember when we did the gooseneck, and I'm glad we've done that, because you saw trying to keep track and with one wheel guiding it on that perfect 90 degrees, that's hard. What this does is this stays the dual wheels drive me. Now, this prompted me to do the ellipse, because the main thing I wanted you to get out of the ellipse was using the router and a wheel to cut the opposite side of your pattern. Now, like we said, you can bandsaw it and saw it to the line, but you need your pattern to be really, really good. Now, in this case, what I did was I have a pattern for the gooseneck. The other thing I was able to do, instead of having to have all that big mess out here to index off of, I was able to actually cut the gooseneck to the exact size. Then, by doing basically exactly what we did with the gooseneck, of being able to take and loosen, now I can loosen these nuts and move my router left to right, wherever I want to position my bits to make the cuts. Now, common sense tells you that when you're doing this, and particularly in a gooseneck, you've still got that profile to cut. So you got a lot of meat to haul out there. So rough cutting it first with like a, here I've got a 1/4 inch spiral that I had, or a 1/2 inch, or whatever the case. And just kind of roughly hogging all of that out to leave enough to be able to use your box core, to use your little cove bit to do the bottom. Now, the only difference with this is that on the particular gooseneck, is that we can't use the little router bit that we used to cut the bead. In that case, there's one of two bits we want to use. Now this, and again, make sure when you read by these, the shaft on this is going to be a little short. That's another thing with the jig, is I didn't want the rails down here. Then that makes me have to have a whole lot more bit length. And that's the reason for the 1/4 inch plywood, is because I want to get as much travel as I can. Now, the other thing with a plunge router is that a lot of times, a lot of them, you can get this collet all the way down. So perhaps one of these little short bits would work, but also if you can get a longer length, do it. And if you can get a 1/2 inch shank, do it. Now this is just a 1/4 radius, but you can see the end of this is flat. So where we have those little steps in there, this is actually going to cut the little step. This one, usually, I don't know, they're always a little longer. And it's basically the same thing, except it has a sharp point. Now the neat thing about this jig is that I can bring my bit down to whatever depth I want. And with that big hole and coming in on my end out here, I can see exactly where I'm going to be hitting. While we were able to be pretty precise in the old way we did the gooseneck, using the pattern cutting, this was just, it's just another step up and an easier way of doing it. And just like where we was doing that ellipse, can you imagine, like we'll call it an elliptical or oval, ever how you want to do it. Say a freestanding mirror, with the post on each side where the mirror swivels. And taking it and doing it out of some 8/4 and being able to take this and go all the way around that thing and carve that whole thing out, kind of like a gooseneck, you would have a lot of people wondering how you pulled that off, and that would be beautiful. Or if you were doing something like an oval picture frame. We've done them, where you're able to route the inside edge and then you're able to route the outside edge. But being able to get out in the middle of that thing and do something without having our router move or whatever the case. Be a pretty cool thing. Now again, the wheel, smaller picture frame, you might want a smaller wheel or a bearing. But the point is that what you want to be able to do is to be able to move your wheels in to whatever width you want, and you want to be able to move your router and cut just, basically whatever you want. Now I'm going to move, I could sit here and you could watch me route this whole thing forever, but that's just not necessary. I feel sure you've got it. But I am going to move it a little bit, and I'm going to plow a groove right down through here just so you can see how well it tracks. Yeah, some wing nuts would have been kind of nice there, but again, that hindsight thing. See what I can do here? I can take this puppy, get it on here, and I can adjust in wherever I want. Can you see the bit? I mean, if I've got a line here or coming up this side, man, I can get this thing right in on where I want to be. And I don't know, I haven't had any issues with it ever moving, so. But it's like anything else new. Build your jig, play with it, get a feel for it. Now, I did something else on this one. I rigged me up a little bit of dust collection. Adjust our depth. Now I'm going to emphasize again. If you're in that oval mirror, you don't have a start-stop point. You know what I'm saying? You don't have to come into something. Now I'm doing this kind of backwards from the way I would prefer, because I'd rather be able to come in and start. Now this bottom piece, remember now that the two pieces here would be my wood. This is my pattern. This is what I'm indexing off of. And now you got to have a level table. You want something level because this is riding on it. And you want to make your patterns longer so that you have a start-stop point to where you can travel past with your cut. You see how perfectly that tracked it? The thingamajig. All right, guys, on the same theory and principle as the thingamajig, doohickey, whatchamacallit, here's something else you can do. Now, I was thinking a minute, you could set that thing up, and instead of having wheels, you could bring two pieces up to where you could clamp on a piece of wood, like a top of a leg or whatever, and adjust that. And you could probably make it to where you could move it to do mortises, okay? But here's another one. Actually taking a base and mounting wheels to it, in this case rollers or bearings. And you can actually take your base and make these slotted so you can lock them down. And what you can do is, this is a self-centering. If you're equally, what you do is you simply twist it, okay, and drive it. Great for putting mortises in the center of things. Now to offset it, you can actually put another piece of wood back over here, and when you do it, it'll kick it one way or the other. But it's a twist thing to where you've got both bearings engaged. That's pretty slick. Just another way of driving a router.